was a rainy night on the Skarloey Railway. All the engines had been confined to the sheds as it was deemed too dangerous for them to work at night. It was mostly silent, apart from the groaning of one engine. "Ach, it's so pathetic. We are stuck in the sheds. Well, the standard gauge are out operating. Tell me, how is this fair?" complained Duncan. Skarloey had had enough of his moaning, so decided to butt in. "Look, Duncan, I know this isn't ideal for us, but unfortunately we don't have a choice. Mr. Percival made it very clear that if we are to continue operating, we must not take such unnecessary risks." Duncan just rolled his eyes. "Ach, you're such a fool, Skarloey. The rain was a lot worse earlier during the day than what it is now. So tell me, why on earth are we stuck in the shed when we could go out there and actually do some work?" Of course, many of the engines just groaned as usual. However, Peter Sam decided to push his luck. "You know, Duncan, it's a real shame, you know. You complain about being overworked, and when you're not working enough, you're complaining that you're underworked. Is there no satisfying you?" Duncan began to groan. Ugh. Just then, Sir Handel butted in. "All right, Peter Sam, that's enough. Look, I know I may sound like Duke now, but listen, we're all here in the sheds, so why don't we just stop arguing about the rain and focus on something else?" "I couldn't agree more, Falcon," as Duke puffed in. "What we need is something to take our minds off of things," as Duke said. Skarloey and Rheneas looked at each other. "Do you think we should tell them?" "Tell them what, Rheneas?" "You know, about him." "Rheneas, I don't think that's such a good idea. We vowed never to speak of that incident again." The other engines had overheard the two old engines, and they decided that they wanted to know. "Come on," said Peter Sam. "What are you going on about?" "You may as well tell them, Skarloey. They won't stop bugging you until you do," said Duncan. Skarloey looked at his buffers. "It's not a particularly nice tale to tell, but if you insist, we will tell you." And they began. You see, many years ago, before the first railway line was ever built on this part of Sodor, there used to be an old fort up in the hills. You can still reach the ruins today, but back then it was an important base. It was serving between the Napoleonic War and the First World War. However, there was one officer there that nobody would dare argue with. His name was Colonel Richard Sharp. He had many reasons to hate the people around this area. You see, none of them in the local area at the time accepted the English. They were all Sudrian villages round here at that time. But of course, he didn't care. He simply told them that if they came near the fort without permission, they would be shot or fired upon. However, one night, the Sudrians had had enough. They actually stormed the fortress, and then they laid waste to the entire battalion that was here. The only person they left alive was Colonel Richard Sharp. But of course, they had left him on top of a flagpole. And when the army arrived to find him, all they found was a skeleton tied to the flagpole, and the bodies of his men. Of course, shortly afterwards, many people started saying when they were hiking in the hills, they could hear the battle that took place between the Sudrians and the riflemen. course, it's not really known what happened properly, as many witnesses, in fact, there was none left after the battle. However, 2 days after these events started, the fort exploded from its old gunpowder magazine. And then the man started appearing. Up in the hills on the old path where it used to lead to the fort, a man can be seen regularly on stormy and cold nights like tonight. He's always guarding his post, making sure the fortress can never be attacked again. But they say that if you see him, you are destined for bad luck, just like those men fell all those years ago. Skarloey finished his story. The other engines were in absolute disbelief. They had never heard of such a thing happening before. But Duncan had to butt in. Och, are you saying that again, Skarloey? Things that go bump in the night are rubbish. It's not fake, Duncan. It really happened. That historical part I can understand, aye. But the whole thing about a colonel still haunting the hills. What evidence do you have to that? Skarloey looked away, looking to Rhaenys. Well, Duncan, let me explain. You see, when we were expanding into the hills originally, we were originally planned to go down the south side of the mountain, not the north. However, every time we got close to where the old fort was once stood, our materials would either go missing or our gunpowder would explode. And I warn you, Duncan, he doesn't take kindly to disrespect. So if I were you, if you're up in the hills anytime soon, you better keep your guard up, 'cause he might just come for you. Duncan just laughed. Well, in that case, I'm going to sleep. Good night. And Duncan went to sleep quite easily. Unlike the other engines, they were all petrified for what Peter Sam, Skarloey and Rhaenys had told them. The next morning, the engines awoke. Not all of them were able to get any sleep, but Duncan was wide awake. You say that? You believe some fake story and you can't sleep for the night. You know, it's so good that I'm in steam. You know. Just then, a familiar voice broke out. Well then, Duncan, you can take the first passenger train down the New South Line. New South Line, sir? Duncan asked in confusion. He was not aware of any new lines. Yes. You see, Duncan, Skarloey and Rhaenys have been building a path down the southern side of the mountain, and you get to be the first passenger train to go down it, he says. And I hope you enjoy this, as this will be your punishment for teasing them. Good night. Duncan just groaned. Ugh! Why do you two get me in trouble so much? Don't blame us. It's you and your attitude that has done that. Now get on your way. The Come along, you bumpy coaches. As soon as I get this job over with, the sooner I can return to my shed. The coaches just grumbled. Oh, how can this disgusting engine ever pull such fine things as us? The coaches cried. Ugh, I've heard of troublesome trucks, but sometimes I think it should be troublesome coaches. Duncan carried on and went into the hills. As Duncan arrived at the new top station, he was impressed. Now this is a kind of station an engine can get behind. Of course, what Duncan failed to realise was that there was a man watching him on the platform. No one else had noticed, but a little girl had noticed. And she walked up to Duncan. Duncan, do you see that man over there? And she pointed to where she'd seen the man. But when Duncan looked, he was gone. Are you trying to pull my wheels or something? Now Duncan was very rude to his colleagues and to the rolling stock, but passengers he was never rude to. I'm just saying, I just saw a man in green standing on the other platform. I was not aware of who he was. I just thought he was one of the passengers. It's all right. Go get back in the coaches. We're setting off in a moment. And as the cavalcade set off, they came up to the mountain pass. And as they went in, it was strange. A fog suddenly began to settle, and the track could not be seen. Oh, I can't see a thing in this fog. Did it even call for fog today? His driver and fireman responded. Not to our knowledge, old boy. It was supposed to be clear skies tonight. Or today. We'll stop at the next signal and we'll raise the alarm. Good idea. However, when they did reach the next signal, it turns out that Duncan and his train were near the old mountain paths. All of a sudden, his driver and fireman decided to go back down the line, as Duncan's injector had somehow failed. Oh, yep, your injector's failed, old boy. Well then, it actually looks like we're going to have to go back down the line and get some help. Look, be quick. I don't have time for this. As his crew left, Duncan was all alone. The passengers were still in the coaches, but none of them could see or hear what Duncan was doing. All of a sudden, he started hearing footsteps walking up the ballast. So, you're the engine who shows me disrespect, the man said. Ugh, who are you? Are you one of the passengers? The man just looked at Duncan in confusion. Passengers? What on earth are you bringing civilians up here for? The man replied. Oh, I get it. You heard Scarlowy's ghost story and now you're trying to pass yourself off as the ghost. It's not going to work, buddy. But the man still looked even more confused. I am not just some random passenger. I am Colonel Richard Sharp, and I would like for you to show me some respect. Hark! You can dress as an 1812 rifleman all you want, but I am not going to fall for it. Just then, Duncan then looked towards the man's left side. He noticed that his skin and his organs that would have been along his arm had completely disappeared. Oh, what happened to you? That does not look good. I died on these mountains, Duncan. Duncan then began to shake, realizing who this man was. When I was alive, I was dedicated to my job. I didn't realize the Sudrians would attack us like they did. They tore us limb from limb, ripped our skin off, ripped all kinds of things off us, Duncan. And I warn you now, if you don't show respect to my men, or to those who lost their lives in that battle, I promise you, Duncan, you will see me every night, and I'll keep you awake until you suffer a similar fate. Then the man turned around and started to walk into the mist. Oh no, I can't possibly have seen him, Duncan cried. He closed his eyes and refused to open them till his crew returned. His crew returned a little while later, with Skarloey in tow, but Duncan was still shaking. His passengers and the guard had no idea as to why Duncan couldn't move, but Skarloey brought him back down the new line and left him at the start of the station, and then took the passenger train on, and he made sure that to run to time. But when Duncan and Skarloey returned to the shed that night, Skarloey asked him, "Duncan, did you happen to see him last night?" Duncan looked at Skarloey, but didn't say a word. Skarloey knew what Duncan had gone through, and he was very respectful and didn't tell the other engines of Duncan's experience. But now that Duncan travels along that line, he now knows not to make fun of the dead. But do you think he'll learn his lesson permanently? Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But just remember, up in the hills of the Skarloey Railway, there are many, many wonderful things to see. But don't always be fooled by appearances, because you never know who or what could be looking back at you. And Duncan learned this well. Let us hope you enjoy the rest of your Halloween. Good night.